If you follow the climate change issue, you've probably heard something about the social cost of carbon. It certainly had a much higher profile in the last couple of years, although the original idea of developing the social cost of carbon goes back decades. In fact, here in the US, I believe that Minnesota was the first state, as part of the Public Utility Commission, to do an attempt to come up with a social cost of carbon as an official externality value for CO2. This was back in the early 1990s, and I was actually involved in that case. So this topic of trying to figure out the social cost of carbon has been around for a long time. What is it? Well, it is basically an effort to quantify the monetized damages associated with each ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent that is emitted to the atmosphere. So as you can imagine, that's a challenge. I mean, first you have to figure out what the climate change implications are of CO2 emissions, and the idea of the implications of each individual ton get a little bit tricky. But once you have those, and there's a huge amount of uncertainty about those, once you have those, then you have to figure out the economic implications of those impacts in order to come up with the social cost of carbon. And you're talking potentially, 100, 200 years out. So the issue of the discount rate becomes absolutely critical. And you also have to wonder, what's part of the calculations and what's not. When there was a rollout of the federal social cost of carbon a number of years ago, I remember being at a briefing on it, and I raised my hand and I said, how have you factored the costs of ocean acidification into the social cost of carbon? And the answer was, well, we just don't know enough about ocean acidification to factor it into the social cost of carbon, which is a pretty gaping hole in the social cost of carbon. I raised my hand and I said, well, okay, how have you factored in the potential implications of World War III breaking out on Russia's southern border due to water shortages associated with climate change? And the answer was, well, we don't really know what the probability of that is, so there's no way for us to factor that into the social cost of carbon. So we have to be really careful and ask, what's in it and what's not in it. And that becomes one of the really interesting aspects of all of the economic modeling that's been done to try and get at the social cost of carbon. So let me jump into the Climate Web to walk you through just a bit of a structured review of where we are with this issue. I've already mentioned it's been around for years. There's a huge literature on the topic. Many people have come up with very different social costs of carbon, anywhere from negative in the case of some analysis that's actually been published by people funded by the fossil fuel side, to very high numbers funded by people that are focused on the potential implications of catastrophic climate change, including leading economists that look at what is the social cost of carbon if you do think about the possibility of catastrophe within the next 100 or 200 years. But generally, the numbers are much more modest, and the federal government actually adopted a social cost of carbon for use in federal rulemakings. And that number in today's dollars, 2015 dollars, is about $40 a ton per ton of CO2 emissions. So it's each and every ton that is emitted. It's not a total price tag or something. It's each and every ton. Now, the fact that the federal government adopted this for federal rulemaking ended up setting setting the game board for a very different role for the social cost of carbon. Even though it was originally developed specifically for federal rulemaking, what we're seeing is more and more of an effort to use that number, because it now has sort of a basis and it's been legitimized and it's now very recently been upheld in court. So more and more people are trying to use that number in other ways. So Minnesota recently had another case to update the externality value for CO2, and ended up going with the federal social cost of carbon as the best available proxy for a good number. And there are more efforts to get the social cost of carbon applied to cost benefit analysis when doing leases of coal on federal lands. There are all sorts of ways in which one could envision that the social cost of carbon might actually be used in power plant siting proceedings and in mitigation proceedings. Because once you accept the idea that each and every ton is doing a certain amount of damage, that suggests that it makes sense to price those emissions, no matter where they are, at that level. Now, this raises various issues. What if that number is too low, for example, and everybody buys into using it and everybody ends up using it, but it's too low? And this is an issue I've talked about in other places and won't go into detail here. But I think that for the first time, we now have the real possibility that the social cost of carbon, more specifically the federal social cost of carbon, could end up sort of coming through the back door and becoming a national carbon price without actually requiring anything in the form of legislation or national carbon targets or a national cap and trade system. We could see the social cost of carbon migrate into the role of a national carbon price. Now, on the one hand, that would have a lot of implications for certain sectors, certainly in the electricity sector, not so much in the transportation sector. When you think about gasoline, for example, $1 a gallon is the equivalent of about $100 a ton CO2. So with a social cost of carbon number right now of about 40, that's about 40 cents per gallon. And it seems like gasoline prices shift by more than 40 cents per gallon on a monthly basis. So it might be that if this carbon price becomes the backdoor price on carbon, it doesn't actually have much of an effect on the transportation sector, which will create issues in its own right. But let me just jump out of that quick discussion. We have pulled together some of the interesting news coverage, et cetera, including some of the very recent news coverage of this topic, including the recent Minnesota case, which was notable because the whole issue of climate change was almost retried in an administrative courtroom in that case. So it's an interesting thing to look at. But if you did want to go much deeper into the social cost of carbon, you can click on the index entry for the social cost of carbon, and what you'll see there is the social cost of carbon deep dive, which is a massive resource pulling together basically the entire social cost of carbon literature, but also getting into what are the arguments people are making about the social cost of carbon. So there's an awful lot there if you do want to do a deep dive, but there's also plenty here for a more superficial look at the social cost of carbon as a possible backdoor carbon price. We'd welcome your feedback and ideas on this.